Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Mrs. Thinker here, and today we're gonna be diving a little toops deeper into looking at algebra. If you're not aware, this is my Prep for PEP series where I'll be covering various topics to help students get ready for their PEP exams. Now, algebra is a topic that a lot of students tend to be scared of, and I addressed some of these concerns in a previous video, so be sure to check it out. But today, I wanted to cover some basic points about algebra that will help students understand the topic a bit more. So, let's go.
Hey you, over there. I see you struggling with the numbers, but don't have no fear, cause I'm right here. We're gonna grow and learn together, there's no need to despair. Math cool like breeze, you're gonna learn it with ease, so leave your concerns because it's time to learn.
Now, a quick note before we start, I will be using the word variable throughout this video, so let's take a sec to learn what a variable is. Essentially, a variable in math is an unknown item, one that can be changed or adjusted. As you can see, it comes from the word vary, right? Which means to change. Specifically in algebra, variables are used to describe the unknowns that we label as letters. So for example, if a question asks you to find x, it means that our variable is x. Now, the first basic thing to learn, and I feel like if there's nothing else that you remember this. Whenever you see a letter in math, always remember that it represents a number, just a number that you don't know yet. Remembering this fact will not only guide you in what rules to use in algebra, but can also help you when you might be a little bit confused on what works and what doesn't work. I used this in an example in my previous video, so to find out more, check it out if you haven't already. But no, I think I've preached this concept quite a bit so far, so there's not much else to say except letters in math are numbers themselves. Alright, I'm done, let's move on. Now, number 2, like versus unlike terms. In algebra, we describe like terms as being items that are grouped similarly, whereas unlike terms are placed in different groups. For example, if we're looking at the number of pineapples versus oranges in a basket, we can label pineapples as P and oranges as O. They would be considered as unlike terms, and that can be seen from the fact that there are 2 different letters being used to represent them. Now, if we're looking at how many fruits and vegetables that are in the basket, and we label fruits as F and vegetables as V, then both pineapples and oranges would be given the same label F, and therefore would be considered as like terms. Really and truly, it starts by how we label our items. That determines whether or not we're looking at like versus unlike terms. I'll be looking at labeling in a few moments, but an important thing to note is that like and unlike terms help to understand how different operations work in algebra, and that will be covered in our next video. Now, the third thing is learning the difference between expressions versus equations. Now, an expression in math is used to describe a combination of numbers, whether known or unknown, and operations together. When I think of expression, I think of a statement or just saying something, and it's an open-ended statement in math. An equation, on the other hand, combines expressions and relates them to each other. So whether or not they're equal or unequal, an equation will show this. An easy way to point out whether or not you're looking at an equation or an expression is that an equation will always have either the equal sign or an inequality, meaning lesser than, greater than, lesser than or equal to, greater than or equal to, not equal to. Any of those symbols will be in an equation. If it's just a combination of numbers and operations, then it is an expression. Now on to the good stuff, right? Labeling and substituting. The key to solving algebraic problems is knowing how to correctly label our unknowns and use substitution to figure out how to solve the problem. Sometimes in a question, a label might be given, which if they do that, that is just fantastic. But other times, the task is left up to you to, figure out how to correctly label those unknown variables. So let's break down how to correctly do the labeling. We're going to go through a few examples, and as an added challenge, we're also going to be determining whether we are working with an expression or an equation. So here's our first problem. Jerome is 5 years older than his sister Joan. How old is Jerome? Now the first step is to label our unknown variables. We can write that at the very top of the paper. Actually, it should be the very first thing that you see, right? We are going to label our first unknown variable, which is Jerome's age, and we say let J equal Jerome's age. Now writing this helps you to keep track of what your labels mean. So in the middle of answering the question, if you need a reminder of what you're trying to solve, you can always just look at the top of the page and remember what you labeled your unknown variables as. This also helps your teacher or the pet people or whomever is marking your paper to know exactly what your labels are. Them not fear guess nor nothing, yeah? Another tip too is that you can use a letter that is similar to the variable. In random equations, x and y are used, but for worded problems like these, I would say that you can get a little bit creative with your labels, and I think that also helps you to remember them. So I see J for Jerome, so I'm gonna let J equal Jerome's age, right? Now the next thing is to figure out whether there are any other variables and whether they are like or unlike variables. So by looking at the question, what else is an unknown in the question? That is Joan's age. We don't know how old Joan is, right? Would this be considered a like or an unlike variable? Meaning, can we use the same letter J to represent Joan's age? We can't, right? Because J already represents Jerome's age. So this would be considered an unlike variable because Jerome's age is different from Joan's age. And so we have to label it differently. Now, Joan also starts with a J. So I'm going to use S for sister. And we'll say, let S equal Joan's age. Now we can put in our operations by carefully reading how these two variables are related. Yeah? Jerome is 5 years older than Joan. So that means if we have Joan's age, we would add 5 to equal to Jerome's age. It also means that if we start with Jerome's age, we would have to subtract 5 to get to Joan's age. Notice that both of these statements are true. Finally, would this be an expression or an equation? Yeah, we know you can see the equation sign, right? So that means that we have an equation. Okay, so our second problem says, a number multiplied by 2 is greater than the sum of the number and 15. Let's start with our labeling. Our unknown is a number, so we say let n equals the number. Let's look for any more unknowns. There's another part of this problem that has the same number, so this means that it is a like term and it already has a label. So you see, we can use the same label to identify the other part where this says, the number, right? Now let's look at the relationship and start to put in some operations. So follow me now. It says that a number multiplied by 2, right? So if the number is n, if it's multiplied by 2, it would be 2 times n or 2n. Another thing to remember is that when we are combining actual numbers and variables, we tend to write the known number first. Remember that the letters are numbers still, right? So I'm not going to try to differentiate them, but usually we write the known number first and then the unknown number beside it. So that's when we're working with multiplication. So in this case, we would say 2n, and that's just standard, okay? It also says that the sum of the number and 15, which we would write as n plus 15, yeah? Then finally, it says that this part, 2n, is greater than this part, the n plus 15. So we can write that as 2n is greater than n plus 15. We can even put them in brackets to avoid confusion. That's up to you. Now, for this example, we have also an equation because we have two expressions being related to each other by a greater than sign. So 2n and n plus 15 are both expressions, but the whole thing together is an equation. Now, these are just some basic examples because I'm sure you know that it can get a lot more complicated. But not lie, guys, sometimes you have to all draw out things to make it make sense. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of today's lesson. A variable in math is an unknown item that changes. Like terms are used to represent the same variables and are given the same labels, while unlike terms are grouped differently and given different labels. Expressions are just statements in math, while equations will take an expression and equate it to something. And finally, in order to correctly label and substitute worded problems, you should first correctly state each unknown variable, identify all unlike and like terms, then add the operations to describe the relationship between the numbers in the problems. All the numbers, both the known and the unknown ones. And that's where we'll end the video. Remember to like this video if you enjoyed it, comment below if you learned something new, and finally, be a friend and tell a friend. Remember, we're all in this together because math is life.